Well, we've probably just given you almost too much information to decide. You almost reach the point of saturation, and beyond that, it's not necessary to have any more information in order to decide in favor of one solution or proposed conclusion or another for the Quirinius problem. I guess I need to start off saying we're going to try to wrap this up now in looking at this. A. Shore and White says the whole position of Publius Sulpicius Quirinius has reached the point of agnostic stalemate. Is it really at agnostic stalemate? Well, there's a sense in which that's true. There's no way that we can conclusively say exactly what was meant by Luke and what he said. Now, I'm not trying to beg off and not be responsible in giving an answer, because I have some suggestions for a proposed solution here that maybe will say that we're not just with nothing more than an agnostic stalemate as far as the question of Quirinius and Luke. There's no way we can say at this point confidently, until something else is unearthed archaeologically or in some fashion, what Luke has in the back of his mind or in the front of his mind when he said, and after this taxing was first made, this taxing was first made when Quirinius was governor of Syria. However, I think that what we can say, which I kind of alluded to earlier, that eventually we get around to this, but we get around to this more or less in conclusion and not in the beginning, is 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 20 and 21. And that can be summed up as follows. We don't know what Luke meant, but we know that he was right. Now, we don't approach it from that point of view, or then, as I said, you don't really do service to other opinions. To approach things from a position, I already have all the answers, I already know this. Then who can ever teach you anything if you approach something from that point of view? So we don't approach it, but we conclude with that point of view. We don't know exactly what Luke meant, but we know whatever he meant, he was right. The prophecy came not in old time by the will of man, but holy men of God spake as they were moved by the Holy Spirit. Now, that's referring to the Old Testament. There's no doubt about that. But the Old was merely a prophecy of the new to come, and the new is so filled with quotations of the Old that there's obviously an unbreakable connection between the Old and New Testament, so that the authors of the Old were no more and were no less, quote, inspired, end of quote, than were those of the New. So with that behind us, let's come to this question of agnostic stalemate, as Shore and White says. And I've got about 4 points I want to cover this evening, and then give you our own theory. First of all, it is possible that Quirinius was legate of Syria on 2 occasions. That's possible, that is not provable, and we may even go so far as to say it's unlikely. Now, we do have this inscription that was discovered in the 1750s. It talks about a man who was governor of Syria twice, legate twice, according to some people's translation of that. And of course, the problem with that in answering the Luke 2:2 enigma is that no name is given. And as A. Shore and White has aptly stated, it's a dangerous thing to have a headless inscription for your ally, because he can change his mind anytime he wants to. Why? Because he's not bound to anything, because there's no name there. He could change his opinion. Really what he means is we could change our opinion about that headless inscription based on some new archaeological discovery, or fine. If we discovered something else that told us John Brown was legate of Syria twice, we think probably the name that should have gone on that earlier inscription, or was there originally, was John Brown and not Quirinius. So it's not provable. It is possible, but it's probably not likely that Quirinius was governor of Syria on 2 occasions. Now that is the consensus of opinion in conservative scholarship. The NIV Study Bible, I've already said, gives that to you. Ryrie's gives that to you. And just about anything that you read assumes, and where they get this assumption, besides this headless inscription, I don't know. They just assume that Quirinius was legate of Syria on 2 occasions. Once in BC years, maybe 6 to 4, maybe 10 to 7, maybe 4 to 1. We have all these different guesses. We know for the second time, or for the first, whichever the case may be, he was legate of Syria from AD 6 to AD 9. We know that. But was there a first time? If so, when was the first time? It had to be in BC years. We know who was legate in those first AD years, for the first 5 years there. Would have to probably be in the last decade of the BC years. Which years? We don't know. NIV gives you something, Study Bible. Ryrie gives you something else. Every other author would give you something in that general category. What are they basing it on? According to A.N. Shure and White, may be a mistranslation to begin with of this famous 1750 inscription that was discovered, where it's not necessary to translate it that this man was legate or governor of Syria for the second time. Just meant that it could mean that he was governor after he did something else. The second is the important word, of course, that whoever this was governor or legate of Syria for the second time. That's not a necessary translation. It's a possible one, but it's not a necessary one. So what we're going to do, basically then, and I think that this is the only honest thing to do, is we're going to have to put out of the mind and the picture completely the fact or the suggestion that Quirinius was governor on 2 occasions. We just have to put that out. We don't have any proof of that at all, none whatsoever. We're just grasping for a conservative straw. It's what we're doing to fortify Luke's position here, to make sure that we know, that the critical scholars know that Luke is right and not wrong. Of course, we still have to deal with this whole date problem. If we've got him legate way back 10 to 8 BC, and therefore the census is taken sometime during his first governorship, 10 to 8 seems to be too early for Christ to have been born during that period of time. So you still have the date problem. That's a possibility. It's probably unlikely, but it's the consensus of opinion in conservative circles today. We're just going to not do anything with it, but put it out of the picture. Secondly, if that's not true, then it is possible that he could have worked in an extraordinary capacity, either under or above another man who was, technically speaking, the official legate of Syria. Now, do you understand what I'm saying there? It's possible that he could have worked in an extraordinary capacity, either under or above another man. And whoever this man was, he would have been the official legate of Syria. Therefore, you say, well, we still have the problem with Luke 2:2. Well, not immediately anyway, because here's what we have. This taxing was first made, now it all assumes that we're going by this translation instead of this was the first such and such that was done under Quirinius or Quirinius. And of course we've got problems with that. The NIV renders it otherwise. This is the first one that was done under him, which implies at least a second one to be done. But anyway, we won't deal with that just yet anyway. This taxing was first made when Quirinius or Quirinius was governor of Syria. We'll say, no, he called him governor of Syria. That's right. He didn't call him legate. Legate was a technical, correct term for the Roman official who was in control of the province of Syria. Legate, not governor. We remember from earlier studies that Luke, most of the time, is very technical whenever he gives a term. If they control a tetrarchy, then he says they control a tetrarchy. He doesn't just say, well, they control an ethnarchy, when really they control a tetrarchy. Whenever he does give a technical term, he's never wrong. However, that doesn't mean that he always gives a technical term. That's something else entirely. Whenever he gives a technical term, he's never wrong whenever he does that. But he doesn't always give a technical term. For instance, over in chapter 3, and here would give us a little bit of a problem with what I'm saying of a proposed solution for Luke 2:2. In other words, what I'm saying of Luke 2:2 is maybe he's not intending to even imply that Quirinius was legate of Syria. He was governor. He worked in some other extraordinary official capacity, either under or above whoever was the official legate of Syria at this time. And because Luke knows very well Quirinius was not legate, then purposely he avoids calling him legate but calls him governor. That could be less than a legate. It could be greater than a legate. He worked in some extraordinary capacity. However, in Luke 3 and verse 1, he also doesn't give technical terms, but it doesn't prove that these men weren't in the position we know exists behind the looser terms that he gave. Here's what I mean. Now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being prefect of Judea. That's what he was. He was prefect. Governor is just a loose sense. So see, he used governor here, but he meant the technical office of the prefect, because we know that's what Pontius Pilate was. Okay, for the analogy then, if you turn back to Luke, then what we would have here is, and this taxing was first made when Quirinius was governor, and we know Luke really means the official office of legate. And we know he wasn't, or we're assuming that he wasn't. So there's where it ended up with problems. And Luke 3 and verse 1 would give us our problems then. Now he goes on to call in Luke 3:1. Herod a tetrarch, Philip a tetrarch, Lysanias a tetrarch. And we haven't gotten into verse 2. We'll do that. We're not into religious studies in the intertestamental period yet, just political studies. Verse 2 we'll have to study in its religious context, and we'll change some of the wording in the KJV there. And Luke is quite correct in what he says about Annas and Caiaphas in Luke 3 and verse 2. King James says Annas and Caiaphas being the high priests, plural. Well, you can't have two high priests. You can only have one. So we have a big problem here, Annas and Caiaphas being the high priest. It's impossible to have two high priests. You can only have one, or he wouldn't be called the high priest. He'd be called the priest on the level with another one who's on his level. Or we'd have to say two high priests then, and that's not possible. So I'm saying he's correct in his terminology in verse 2. He calls all of these other people tetrarchs that are tetrarchs in verse 1. Tiberius he calls Caesar, the Roman emperor. The one thing is Pontius Pilate, and he calls him governor. He doesn't call him prefect here, he calls him governor. So since he used governor in a loose sense here, you could speak of Pontius Pilate as being the governor. There's no doubt about that. You could speak of him as being the governor. We know that his official title was a prefect, later a procurator. Since he uses a loose term there, but he really has reference behind that to the technical term of the prefect, then we can only assume, well, he must be thinking the same way back here in chapter 2 and verse 2. This taxing was first made when Quirinius was governor, and I really mean by that, legate of Syria. However, that's just guesswork. That's just saying because he did something in a certain way in chapter 3, we know he had to have done it the same way in chapter 2. How can you prove that? Well, you can't prove that, not just by saying that. Don't we have the right to vary in the way we think and the way we write? Well, certainly we do. So that doesn't prove anything. It's just another suggestion. We still, of course, would have the time factor to consider here of putting him way back 10 to 8 B.C. This is what, of course, William Ramsey has done. Made Quirinius governor or legate of Syria on the first occasion from 10 to 7 B.C., on the second occasion from 6 to 9 A.D. Maybe then what we would understand from this suggestion is that another man was the legate, but maybe Quirinius was either A, the one who had broad control over Syria, or B, he's the man who carried out the decree of Caesar Augustus as he worked underneath the legate of Syria. And either one of those could be a very good guess. Go over that again. According to this suggestion that we're saying here, possibly he worked in an extraordinary capacity. I said either above or underneath whoever was the official legate of Syria. If he worked above him, then I said, A, what that means is that Quirinius was in some sense the broad controller of Roman affairs. in the Eastern Empire, so that he even had control over the legate of Syria. Or he could have worked under the legate of Syria. Therefore, he would have been the man who was the official who, I don't know, carried the decree from Syria down to Judea to make sure it was carried out by the people. So in other words, he's kind of slave labor. He did the legwork. And since he's actually the one who brings the decree to Judea, to Palestine, then we would reason that's why Luke mentioned his name, Quirinius, in Luke 2:2, and not whoever was the official legate. It's another possibility. Thirdly, what have we seen? We're on this third point here, but let me ask you a question. What have we seen thus far as the Roman census system is concerned? What do we already know from history about the Romans taking a census? Every 14 years. And what are the dates that we already have proven? 104, backwards every 14 years, which gets back to what? 6 AD, 8 BC. Those are really the only two we need to really be concerned about. There's an AD 6 one, there's a BC 8 one. Okay, this third point would say something like this. Let's accept the 8 BC census. And then let's assume it was deferred several years in Palestine because of the tumultuous affairs toward the end of Herod's life. And here's where our studies in Herod's life become important. You know all the intrigue that happens not only at the end of his life, but throughout his life. But particularly in the last couple of years of his life. He's suspicious of everyone. He has everyone murdered. He wants to make sure there is weeping in the land whenever he dies, so he gives order for other Jews to be killed, so someone will be crying about somebody whenever he's stuck in the ground. We know what's happening at the end of Herod's life. Judea is in an uproar. And, of course, we've got him slaughtering the children in Bethlehem because of the report of the Magi that the King of the Jews has been born. We know we have a lot going on in Judea, a lot of difficult affairs taking place in the end of Herod's life. So maybe the census began in 8 BC, but it would have taken several years to work its way to Palestine, either up to Palestine from Egypt or down to Palestine from Asia Minor and Syria. Therefore, in Judea, it would have taken place around 6 to 5 BC. And therefore do what? Well, correspond with Matthew's account of the birth of Jesus during the last 2 years of Herod's life. What do we do with Quirinius with this suggestion? Well, we would make him maybe Rome's representative at large in the Levant, which then would put him in the A position under number 2 over the legate of Syria. Quirinius was just kind of ambassador at large for Rome in the eastern part of her empire. Then, of course, we would have to interpret this phrase, when Quirinius was governor of Syria, in a very loose sense, definitely in a very loose sense. Luke would not be thinking that Quirinius was legate. Someone else was legate, and just who that was we'll have to get to later on. We kind of know from history who was legate during those years there. Just who was legate, he's not really thinking about that. He's thinking about Quirinius, the man who has more power in the eastern part of the Roman Empire than does the legate of Syria, which is the most powerful province in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. And therefore, to be the man over the man who controls the most powerful province would give you quite a lot of power yourself. Okay, if it's 8 BC, that would mean it's the second census under Augustus. Remember, according to Tacitus and Suetonius, we have 3 of these taking place under Augustus. We know these 2, so we know one must have taken place in 22 BC. The first one, the one in 22, had nothing at all to do with Quirinius. That was way before we began looking at his life, which was 12 BC, for the little biographical, chronological look at the affairs of his life. Hit and miss because we have gaps in it, of course. It would also maybe be reasoned that Luke mentions him because of Luke's knowledge of the second census taking place in AD 6, which was by far the better known of the two. And we know that Luke's work was really a 2-volume work. We can't really separate Luke from the book of Acts. Therefore, he intends for us to understand Acts 5:37 as being a reference to the AD 6 census, quote unquote. I'll explain what I mean by that later. But he'd have us understand Acts 5:37 as referring to the AD 6 one. He'd have us understanding Luke 2:2 as the 8 BC one. Then you also might want to take the view and translate this word prote instead of first as prior. This was the taxation or the taxing done prior to when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Then we're back to understanding that the word governor is used in its technical sense as the legate of Syria, but Luke's not saying he was governor. This took place prior to when he was legate in Syria. But I said in the last teaching we don't have any versions that follow that translation, so it just doesn't seem to be possible. Got any answers yet? You seeing any answers? Any light at the end of the tunnel? What are you coming up with thus far? Got any answers yet? Okay, let's come on to number 4 then. Now here's a point of evidence, and I haven't listed, I haven't given you yet. Toward the end of Herod's life, Augustus began to treat him more like a subject rather than a friend or ally, which he had been for so many years. Basically because he becomes suspicious of him. Remember that little quote I gave you? All these things tie together, you see, that Augustus made about Herod. What was the quote that Augustus Caesar said about Herod? I'd rather be his hog than his son. Why? He's very, very suspicious of Herod, knows what a treacherous soul he is. So it's getting toward the end of his life, the end of Herod's life. Augustus does not treat him. We know at this time, here's what you need to get down, Augustus sent a decree to Judea requiring all people in Judea to swear an oath of loyalty to him. In other words, to more or less either draw away or at least secure the allegiance of the Jewish people to himself and away from Herod the Great. You know, lest Herod the Great kind of get the Jews to rise up against Augustus and break away from the Roman Empire. So he required all Judea to swear an oath of loyalty to him. Somewhere at the end, we don't know the dates of this. All we know is at the end of Herod's life. So we could say anywhere from maybe 10 to 4 BC, maybe 6 to 4 BC. And some type of enrollment was enforced in Judea at this time. Now that has been a very inviting solution to this problem. But we have some problems with it, though. Let me give you another point of evidence still underneath this same thing. That an imperial census might be imposed on a single Roman holding can be proven from other writings. Tacitus Annals 641. Tacitus Annals 641 tells us that in AD 36, the Roman emperor imposed an enrollment just on Archelaus II of Cappadocia. This wasn't part of the 14-year cycle, but this just goes to prove that Rome could, out of the ordinary, break in the general practice of the 14-year cycle and deal with one nation or one province or one group of people individually, even though it doesn't fall in the 14-year cycle. See, what we're trying to do is we got this problem of 8 BC, because that's too early for Christ's birth. We need to move that down several years, get it down to 6 or 5 or 4 BC, 6 or 5 BC really. So Tacitus Annals 641 tells us that during AD 36, enrollment was imposed on Archelaus II. That was a common name. Archelaus II of Cappadocia. Well, we have some problems with that. This is a very inviting solution, and I think some people have swallowed this because there's nothing else quite as satisfying or as inviting to find out, well, we don't have to really be concerned about anybody else. All we have to be concerned about is Judea, that somewhere at the end of Herod's life, Augustus imposed a census and enrollment on them, some type of enrollment in the process of having them swear an oath of loyalty to him. Therefore, since it's at the end of Herod's life, probably it was somewhere from 6 to 5 to 4 BC, and that would fit in our chronological framework and would fit in Luke's and would fit in Matthew's as well. But our problem exists right here in Luke, though. It came to pass in those days there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. So just giving us a solution to what's happening in Judea, this oath of loyalty, doesn't really answer the question here. Doesn't really answer it at all. What we have, according to Luke 2:1, is part of the 14-year cycle. That's what I'm saying. It doesn't seem like we can get away from 8 BC. It has to fit in this part of the 14-year cycle, or we never would have had all the world should be taxed. And, of course, if it has nothing to do with anyone or anything but Judea and the Jews, then why even have the reference in verse 2 to Quirinius in Syria? That'd be totally beside the point. If we're not talking about Syria, if we're not talking about Quirinius, if Quirinius doesn't even exist in Syria at that time, if he's not legate until 10 years after that, if all we're talking about is an oath of loyalty and some enrollment that followed that imposed upon the people in Judea, then why would we have to except to confuse us then? And yet Luke is very definite, very specific, very precise in what he says here. This was the first, evidently, enrollment or taxation that was done whenever Quirinius was governor of Syria. You have an answer yet? Here's what my answer is. We'll work our way through this step by step. Okay, number one. And we're not reasoning this point one because we're in our last teaching now. But number one, Luke is not contradicting what Matthew said. Now that's probably the chief contention of A. N. Sherwin White, is Luke is trying to correct the earlier misconception that was spread abroad in the tradition of Matthew's gospel. Luke is obviously not trying to, and even if he didn't try to, he's still not going to fail because of the power of the Holy Spirit. We give that first point, but it's really the last one because that's what we're in, the last message here. If we're going to accept Luke for what he said in chapter 1, and we're on point 2, in chapter 1 and verse 5 and chapter 1 and verse 36, then we're also going to have to dispel this notion that there's internal contradiction in Luke. See, one thing White was saying is Luke contradicts Matthew. And then another thing he says is Luke contradicts himself in giving us 1:5. Not the 136 passage, but 1:5. And the reason that he did that is just that it was too well accepted among the people. In other words, John the Baptist wasn't born during the days of Herod the Great. He was born during the days of Quirinius, which was around AD 6. And they were 6 months apart. But we have them 6 years apart, or 10 to 12 years apart. if we put Jesus way up during the time of Quirinius and his second, quote, end of quote, legateship or governorship in Syria, and John the Baptist way back to the last couple of years of the reign of Herod the Great. So I'm talking about Luke 1:5. There was in the days of Herod, the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zechariah, the course of Abijah, and his wife was of the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. So they're both of priestly descent. And verse 13, thou shalt have a son, and thou shalt call his name John. Verse 24, and after these days his wife Elizabeth conceived and hid herself 5 months. Verse 36, behold, thy cousin, Mary, thy cousin Elizabeth, she hath also conceived a son in her old age, and this is the 6th month with her that is called barren. Verse 41, it came to pass that when Elizabeth heard the salutation of Mary, the babe leaped in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. She's pregnant. When is she pregnant? She has John. She's in the later stages. When is it? It's during the days of Herod the Great, somewhere toward the end of Herod's life. Then you jump right into chapter 2, and there's no change of chronology. There's no change of time here, unless we're going to accept the critical presupposition that just the name Quirinius would throw us for a loop and move us to AD years in Luke 2:2. No, we read the whole chapter here. We've read a large portion of it. We don't have any change in anything, so Luke couldn't be contradicting himself. He could only have reference to what he has already stated as taking place in the days of Herod the Great. Therefore, that must mean that the ending of Herod's life must have overlapped with the beginnings of the importance of Quirinius in Syria. No other solution. No other answer. The end of Herod's life had to overlap the beginning of the years of the importance of Quirinius in Syria.
For the continuation of this message,
the end of Herod's life had to overlap the beginning of the years of the importance of Quirinius in Syria. Whatever number we're on, what are we on? Okay, we'll just say 7. I think we're on 3. That's what I'm on anyway. You don't know when I'm changing gears, though. We're going to accept the NIV translation, not the KJV here. This was the first taxing made whenever Quirinius was governor of Syria. That's a more reliable translation, and it's more difficult. It puts us in a box now. We're going to have to end up with 2 of these things under Quirinius then. This was the first one done whenever Quirinius was governor. Now, I can't be talking about the first census, you see, because the first one was 22 BC, just the first census in general. It has to be the first one that has some type of relationship to Quirinius. And since we know of the one in AD 6, this one has to be the 8 BC one. So we're going to accept the NIV translation of this verse. Number 4. We're going to furthermore assume that Luke and Acts are one book. That he purposely gave us the first reference to the first, well, as King James says, taxing. We're going to deal with that. That's going to be part of our whole answer here in a moment. He gives us our first one in Luke 2:2. And he says this is the first one that was done. Obviously, whether Luke knows it or not, the Holy Spirit knows what he's going to go on to write in the book of Acts, knowing that he is going to give us the second one whenever we get to the book of Acts. If you turn back over to Acts, we'll refresh our memory of Acts 5:37. See, Luke's given us both of these. Some people try to confuse them and say he's talking about the same thing. That word first, prote, that word first over there in Luke 2:2 seems to dispel that theory. He said this is the first one done under some type of control as governor of Quirinius. The second one is done here in Acts, or mentioned here in Acts 5:37. After this man rose up Judas of Galilee in the days of the taxing. and he drew away much people after him. He also perished, and all, even as many as obeyed him, were dispersed. Acts 5:37. He intends for us to understand that, and we know. You say, well, how do we just know that from Acts and Luke? Well, we don't. But we know it from Josephus, that the problems surrounding this man, Judas, from Galilee or from Gaulonitis, wherever he was from, this man, Judas, had to do with the year AD 6. We know that from the writings of Josephus, and that seems to be true from what Luke says here in the book of Acts. Okay, 5 or whatever we're on now. Ramsey had told us, according to Ramsey's writings, Ramsey had told us that Quirinius was governor for the first time 10 to 7 BC. And that Saturnius was governor 8 to 5 BC. Saturnius, that's the name that Tertullian has in Luke 2:2, without any textual support at all, so we're not opting in favor of it. That's the dates of William Ramsey. However, those seem to be mistaken. Of course, that's assuming a dual legateship of Quirinius. Saturnius was legate from 9 to 7. And one Varus, V-A-R-U-S, was legate from 7 to 4 BC. Proof for that, Josephus, Antiquities, 1752. Antiquities 1752. Well, that just shoots into outer space the whole theory about Quirinius being governor twice sent, because we've got to have him somewhere in these BC years. We've got to have him before Jesus is born. We know Jesus is born prior to 4 BC. And look, all the years from basically 10 to 4 BC are taken up. The governorship, the legateship up in Syria, are taken up, first of all, by Saturnius from 9 to 7, and most importantly for our point of view, Varus, V-A-R-U-S, is legate in Syria, according to Josephus, from 7 to 4 BC. Who's legate in Syria whenever Christ is born? Varus. Not Publius Sulpicius Quirinius. Not Saturnius, according to Tertullian, but Varus, V-A-R-U-S. See, we're boxing ourselves in, backing ourselves more and more into a corner here. That gives us who our legates are. See, I could have given that way back in the first message, but then it takes all of the mystery out of it then. We've pretty much known all along who the legates are. There's no question about 2 legateships for Quirinius. He was not legate on 2 occasions, not by anything that we know thus far. Next in number. What do we know about the relationship? You think about this. I've dropped all these hints so you could think about these things, or it certainly will make sense to you now. What do we know about the relationship between Augustus Caesar and Quirinius? Close. How do we know that? Public funeral. He petitioned the Senate for a public funeral for this man in the 2nd decade, 3rd decade AD. Very close relationship between these 2 men. What we're going to assume on that basis then. Oh, before I say that, where has Quirinius been in all of his years of public service so far? Has he ever had anything to do in Syria thus far from what we already know about him? He's in Asia Minor, and where else? In Syria. I've given you that before in the chronology. He's been there in Syria, he's been there in Armenia, that region, he's been in Asia Minor. So what we're going to do on that basis then, the fact that Augustus Caesar and Quirinius obviously are on good terms with one another. They are throughout the whole public career of one Publius Sulpicius Quirinius. And that furthermore, he has been in Syria. In other words, he's not a Gallic representative. I mean, that'd really give us some problems. If this man was in North Africa or Gaul, and then Luke mentions him here as governor of Syria, If we can get him from other references, from extra-biblical references over into Asia Minor or Egypt or Palestine or Arabia or Syria or Armenia, somewhere over there, at least we're in where? The eastern part of the Roman Empire. Not the western part, not the southern part down in North Africa. Well, the only references we have to him generally keep us over to the eastern side of the empire. Put us over into Armenia, put us directly over into the province of Syria itself. Not as a legate prior to this time, but certainly with something to do with the emperor's son and some travels that he did in Armenia and in Syria. So we're going to assume on that basis that Augustus Caesar had a tremendous amount of confidence in the man to the point that he possibly served as representative at large for Rome in the Levant. That's been mentioned earlier as a possibility, and that seems to be a very strong possibility. This man's traveling back and forth and has intimate connections with the Roman government through his friend Augustus. So we know of his great importance to Augustus. Therefore, in our wrapping all of this business up, we're going to kind of assume, we don't have proof of this, we just have what we call circumstantial evidence here. We don't have the fingerprints, but we have circumstantial evidence that he was ambassador at large for the Roman Empire in the Levant toward the end of Herod's life. Any problems with that so far? Seems to make sense. We don't seem to be dodging any critical problems thus far, facing them head on. What problems do we have left that we haven't dealt with? The date, that's a chief one. Oh, Jesus, you're talking about. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's still something we have to deal with, but I doubt we'll deal with it in this class, so. Just a Quirinius question. The date, that's the chief thing that we have to deal with. Well, we pretty much know that. He's asking what's considered Syria, whatever is up north of Galilee, north of Iturea, north of Abilene. What about the question of the whole world being taxed? Do we have a problem with that? What's the problem with that? The date? The date with that? You're talking about 6 or 5 BC. And what if we're talking about 8 BC? Then do we have a problem with a worldwide census? No, that's the part of the 14-year cycle right there.
How long does it take to take a census?
All right, that's a good question. How long does it take to take a census? So we're back to dates right there. Let's get off the date question for a minute. What about then the term? I guess we've pretty much come to a conclusion then on this term in chapter 2. Chapter 2, verse 2. This taxing was the first one made when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Does he mean legate? No, Varus is legate. Can he use governor in a loose sense? He can. It's just not, it's not like Luke. He generally gives us a specific term. We do have a reference in chapter 3 and verse 1 where he uses it in a loose sense. He calls Pontius Pilate governor. The problem with trying to use that passage is he had in mind the technical office behind it, which was the prefect. So you almost can't use that. But he does use governor. Could he not mean by governor as the ambassador at large of the Levant? You know what the Levant is. And Syria is, of course, the chief province in the Levant. And therefore to be governor, to be ambassador at large for Rome in the eastern part of the Roman Empire could be said in a loose sense to be governor of Syria. That's still just a minor problem, but it's no big problem. That can be dealt with. Any other problems before we start working on the date, and we'll wrap this up then? What about What about this question? I thought we had kind of brought this up to you before. Some people claim it's only the new and the novel that causes people to revolt. Do you remember that? And yet Judas is causing this great revolt in AD 6. That was the second time then this period of taxation would have taken place in Israel, in Judea. The first one back in 8 BC. Why do you wait until the second time to revolt? It's generally what's new and what's novel that causes people so many problems. Isn't that right about humanity? You grow accustomed to things and you got to pay your taxes, you just got to pay them. The first day you ever have to pay out of your check, that's a big heartache to have to pay. Once you paid for years and years, you don't think about it anymore. You're not generally, there are people out there who revolt whenever they're 40 or 50 or something, but generally it's the first time, it's whatever's new and novel that would cause someone to revolt. Yet we know, according to Acts 5:37, Judas from Galilee leads a group of men against the Romans. He does revolt, and it's in AD 6, not 8 BC. So let's answer that question and the date question here with our last few points. The census was begun in 8 BC. We cannot get away from that. We have a document from, 34 and from 104 that prove when a census was being taken. We know that one was being taken in AD 6 from the writings of Josephus, Antiquities chapters 18 and, or books 18 and, books 17 and 18. So this is the second census taking place under Augustus Caesar, first one in 22 BC. According to Luke, the first one that's taking place under Quirinius. However, it's only the second one under Quirinius where we actually have Quirinius as legate. You know, what I'm thinking when I'm giving you all these statistics is, what if someone discovers archaeologically a new stone tomorrow and blows all of these theories away then? A lot of wasted time then. Pray nobody ever comes up with a solution to this question then. It will be okay. No, if they do, the more the better. I'm still convinced they won't prove Luke to be wrong, though. They might prove me to be wrong, but they won't prove Luke to be wrong, though. The census was begun in 8 BC, probably in Syria and Egypt. Those are two of the... Remember, Egypt and Syria have become provinces way back in BC years. We had that on our chart here. If you look that up on the chart, whenever the Seleucids and the Ptolemies finally capitulate to the Romans as far as becoming a province of theirs, that's way back 3 decades and beyond BC. 64 BC and like 30 BC, dates like that. The Seleucid Empire ends around 64 BC, whenever Pompey takes Syria, and then in 63 takes Palestine. And then around 30, we have the Egyptian country becoming a province of the Roman Empire. So, and those were two very important places. As a matter of fact, the reason I'm telling you that, if I had a picture, I don't want to draw the whole map again, if I had a picture of Rome up here, here's Syria, here's Antioch, and here's Alexandria. Those are the 3 chief cities in the Roman Empire: Rome, Alexandria, Egypt, and Antioch, Syria. So just because some people might think, well, they're so far away from Rome, how do we know the census, whenever it officially began, how do we know that it didn't first start over here in Greece, which was also part of a province of Rome, and then work its way all the way over here to Syria, and work its way down here to Egypt? It may have begun in Greece, but I'm saying simultaneously it would have begun in Egypt and in Syria as well, because these are two of the chief provinces, the 2 chief eastern and southeastern provinces that belong to the Roman Empire. So we're just going to assume, according to the 14-year cycle, that the census began in 8 BC. All right, we're going to go back to what we know about the end of Herod's life. Very stormy end to his life. We're going to assume again that it probably would have taken maybe several years to work its way down from Syria and or up from Egypt to Judea. Why take a little time? Well, remember, Augustus already around the same period of time is imposing an oath of loyalty upon the people in Judea, the Jews. We have other things going on as far as contacts between the Jews in Judea and Augustus back in Rome. We know the whole country's in a state of unrest in the last 2 years of Herod's life. And the whole process of a census is something that takes a lot of time. Look, all these men have to go back to their ancestral home. That's not something that's going to go over well. I mean, the people in Rome are intelligent. That's not something that's going to go over very well in Palestine during the last years of Herod's life. It's going to have to be something that is kind of broached carefully and gradually. Well, we just know about that old city of Jerusalem and those old Jews over there anyway, according to things like Ezra 4 and verse 15. Here's one of the letters written to Artaxerxes by the adversaries of some of the returning exiles. They don't want the city of Jerusalem to be rebuilt. And here's their line of logic. It says, "Search out the book of the records of thy fathers, so shalt thou find in the book of the records, and know that this city, Jerusalem, is a rebellious city, and hurtful unto kings and provinces, that they have moved sedition within the same of old time, for which cause this city was destroyed." In other words, it's kind of common knowledge that Jerusalem and the Jewish people are a rebellious group of people with a rebellious city. According to the writing here of these people writing back against the Jews, they said, you know the city of Jerusalem. You know these Jews here. We're dealing with a rebellious group of people. Why? The only monotheistic people in the world at this day. The only monotheistic people in the world. They're very tenacious. They hold on very dearly and strongly to their beliefs. Therefore, just to bring in the census all of a sudden, when Judea's never experienced a census under the Romans or the Roman Empire before, I think it only makes sense it's going to be gradual, something that takes place over a short period of time, which perhaps would be maybe a few years. It began in 8 BC. Maybe it did not reach Palestine until 6 to 5 BC. Okay, that deals with the date then. Quirinius is not legate. He's governor, quote, unquote, of Syria. He's ambassador at large for the Roman Empire with her eastern concerns. So for a date then of what's going on here in Luke 2, we have 6 to 5 BC. Now, does that correspond with Matthew's date for the birth of Christ? Definitely. Matthew says 6 to 5 BC. Herod dies in 4. He kills all the children in Bethlehem underneath the age of 2. That puts Jesus back born no earlier than 6 BC. Probably either 6 or 5 BC. We would have to have him born then. Herod's just saying anyone under 2. Now, if he had any thought that Jesus might be older, like born back in 10 BC, well, he'd say anyone under 6 or anyone under 7 then. So we're assuming he's born 6 or 5 BC. So that's a date for what we have going on here in Luke. Doesn't contradict what Luke says in chapter 1 and verse 5, that John was born in the days of Herod. So was Jesus. He was born in the days of Quirinius, according to Luke. But Luke's days of Quirinius are the same days as his earlier days of Herod in Luke 1:5, and the same as Matthew chapter 2's days of Herod as well. What about Judas of Galilee, though, in Acts 5:37, revolting in AD 6? Remember, some people have said only at the new and the novel, something strange, something unfamiliar, would people revolt. Therefore, if Israel is really experiencing a period of taxation here in Luke 2 and verse 2, they never would have waited until AD 6 to cause the problems. You revolt over what's strange and unfamiliar. You don't wait until it comes around the second time. Remember the great problem we have in the Gospels with the subject of taxation? We have that popping up on numerous occasions. What should we do? Should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? They come and ask Jesus, trying to trip him up. That was a big question. And all that's founded upon, all of that you see in the Gospels is founded upon the revolt of Judas of Galilee, mentioned in Josephus, mentioned in Luke the historian in Acts 5 and verse 37. That was the beginning of all of that. Why not back with the first period of taxation? Pardon? Get rid of Herod?
Get away from him and
Notice what you have in your margin in your KJV. This seems to be the answer, and it seems to have been picked specifically. Well, what is a census? Is a census the same as taxation? Do they necessarily come together? This taxing was first made when Quirinius was governor of Syria, and all went to be taxed. Verse 5, to be taxed, with Mary his espoused wife, being great with child. It's the taxing is the big problem. That costs money. You have to give up green things for taxation. For census, that doesn't cost you anything. That's just a head count. Just counting heads is all you're doing. The word's not taxing here at all. The word is enrollment. It's a census that's being taken here. This enrollment was the first one made when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And all went to be enrolled. Really should be spelled with an E and not an I like you have in your margin. But anyway, you get the idea. Enrolled. All went to be enrolled, everyone into his own city. Verse 5, to be enrolled with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child. Because, hey, listen, Joseph and Mary, they're traveling from Nazareth down to Bethlehem. Let's assume they're going down there to be taxed. They have any money with them to pay for their taxation? How poor are they? They're so poor they have to offer turtle doves. That's about the poorest offering you can offer. Where are we? Chapter 2 and verse 24. To offer a sacrifice according to that which is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. Now that was allowed. That was only allowed for extremely poor people. You brought a bullock down with you if you were a regular Israelite who had some money behind you. You brought a sheep down whenever you came down. You brought an ox down whenever you came down. Evidently they didn't bring the pigeons with them. They would have probably bought them down in Jerusalem. They only had enough money to buy some birds in order to cover the requirements of sacrifice. That's another thorn in the side of saying what we have here is taxation. They don't have the money to be taxed. But we don't have a problem with that because the word is not taxed, the word is enrolled here. All they go down there for is an official census. It's a head counting. And of course, as we've already explained, it takes place not in the city of residence, but in the ancestral home. Okay, then if you go, you don't have to go, we've probably got it memorized by now. Acts chapter 5 and verse 37, Judas of Galilee rose up in the days of the taxing. Now, according to Josephus, in this census of AD 6, it was not just a census, but it was a period of taxation as well. Consequently, if all of our logic is really logic, and really true to what we know to be the case and the facts thus far, what we have here would be no problem at all. In Luke 2, we have nothing but an enrollment that will serve as the basis for later taxation. How can Rome really tax Judea when Judea is not a part of the Roman Empire until Archelaus is banished to Gaul in AD 6 and the Roman prefects take over? You remember that? See, all of these things are so important. The year AD 6 is so important. Rome can't tax a country that doesn't even belong to her. It's more or less a client kingdom at this time, controlled by the Herodian leaders. Herod the Great first, and then Archelaus underneath him. Well, that would clear everything up as far as I'm concerned then. We don't have any problem at all. The reason no one is revolting over this first taxing, end of quote, is because we don't have a taxing here. It's nothing but a census. Why is a census being taken? Well, Of course, the census is being taken all over the Roman Empire. Why in Judea? Since Judea is not a Roman province, it's just a client kingdom, because the end of Herod's life is here. Augustus Caesar can tell that. He probably has in the back of his mind, Judea, I'm eventually going to incorporate into the Roman Empire. He lets Archelaus go ahead and continue to rule for 10 years whenever he's banished to Gaul in AD 6. That's the end. Augustus Caesar takes Judea from the status of a client kingdom and makes it part of the province of Syria then. And whenever it becomes officially part of the Roman Empire, then is when taxation begins. Prior to that, all we have is a head count. Anticlimactic or climatic? I think it's climatic.
Amen.
We end up with our solutions then. To the best of my ability, the best of our ability, and we're kind of throwing away some of these other conservative solutions because they just seem to be grasping at straws. They're really not explaining all of this. So what we have is it has to begin in 8 BC, but it probably doesn't begin in Palestine then. It's going to take a little time to work its way there. It's not taxing as the KJV has suggested. See, that throws you for a loop right away. If you know it's a census being taken here, it's an enrollment taking place. No money involved, just a head count. No one needs to revolt. Don't people revolt over the new and the novel? Yes, and the first time the new and the novel take place is AD 6, whenever Judea is incorporated into the Roman Empire as part of the province of Syria, and a tax is levied on the people. And so Judas revolts. He doesn't want to pay a tax. Makes all the sense in the world.